Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a family of 3 who drove into the Oklahoma mountains to look at land and never came home. Their truck was found days later with their dog still inside, $32,000 in cash in the back seat, and all their belongings untouched. For years later, their skeletal remains were discovered just miles from where the truck was abandoned. But no cause of death could be determined, and the mystery of what happened to them remains unsolved. This is the story of the Jamison family. Eufaula, Oklahoma. It's a small town in the southeastern part of the state, population around 3,000, situated on the shores of Lake Eufaula. In 2009, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where life moved slowly, where nothing much ever happened. Bobby Dale Jamison was 44 years old in October 2009. He'd suffered a serious back injury in a car accident in 2003 that left him with chronic pain and on disability. Those who knew him described Bobby as intelligent but troubled, someone who'd struggled with his relationship with his father and seemed to be searching for something, though what that something was remained unclear. Sherilyn Leanne Jamison was 40 years old. She was also on disability, claiming to suffer from bipolar disorder. Sherilyn had a son from a previous relationship who lived with his father, but her focus in 2009 was on Bobby and their daughter. Their daughter was 6-year-old Madison Stormy Starr Jamison, a little girl with her whole life ahead of her, caught up in whatever darkness would ultimately consume her family. The Jamisons lived in a lakeside home in Eufaula. They had timeshares in the United States and Mexico. On paper, they appeared to be living well, though they were actually living beyond their means, relying on disability payments and whatever other income sources they had. But there were signs that all was not well with the Jamison family. Bobby and Sherilyn were intensely religious, but in ways that seemed to veer into paranoia. They claimed their house was haunted. Bobby told their pastor he'd seen 2 to 4 ghosts on the roof. Sherilyn had purchased a satanic Bible, which she claimed was a joke, but Bobby admitted to his pastor that he'd read it. They'd pulled Madison out of kindergarten, claiming problems with the Eufaula School District. They were planning to sue the school, though over what remained unclear. Bobby was involved in legal disputes with his father, Bob Dean Jamison. He'd filed a protective order against his father, claiming Bob Dean had threatened to kill him and his family. Bobby alleged his father had hit him with his vehicle, that his father was involved in drugs and criminal activity, that he was a very dangerous man who thinks he is above the law. Sherilyn had claimed someone poisoned her cats in the weeks before October 2009. She'd spray-painted messages on a storage container they owned, writing, "Witches do not like it when their cats are killed." By October 2009, the Jamisons were planning to leave Eufaula. They wanted to buy 40 acres of land near Red Oak, about 30 miles away in the Sans Bois Mountains, and live in a storage container on the property. Why they wanted to live in a storage container in the remote mountains was never fully explained. On October 8, 2009, the Jamison family loaded up their pickup truck and drove toward the Sans Bois Mountains to look at the land they were considering purchasing. They never came home. On October 16, 2009, 8 days after the Jamisons were last seen, hunters on dirt bikes came across an abandoned pickup truck on a mountain road in Latimer County. The truck was parked on a remote dirt road, about a quarter mile from where the Jamisons had been looking at property. The hunters initially thought the truck had only been there a few hours, but when they looked more carefully, they realized it had been abandoned for days. They contacted police. When officers arrived and examined the truck, what they found was deeply puzzling. Inside the truck was the Jamison family's dog, Maisie. She was severely malnourished but alive, having survived 8 days without food or water, waiting for her family to return. Bobby's cell phone was on the ground near the driver's side door. A GPS unit was nearby. Sherilyn's purse was on the passenger seat, containing her driver's license and identification. In the back seat, Investigators found a brown bag containing $32,000 in cash. $32,000. Both Bobby and Sherilyn were on disability. They had no apparent source of income that would explain having that much cash. Where had it come from? What were they planning to do with it? All of the family's belongings were in the truck. Wallets, IDs, their daughter's toys. Nothing had been taken. If this was a robbery, why would the thieves leave $32,000 behind? But there was no sign of Bobby, Sherilyn, or Madison. And more troubling, there was no sign of struggle. No blood, no indication of what had happened to them. A massive search was launched. Over 300 volunteers and law enforcement personnel combed the area. Search dogs, helicopters, ground teams hiking through the dense woodland of the Sans Bois Mountains. They followed GPS coordinates found in the truck, looking for any trace of the missing family. They found nothing. No bodies, no clothing. No signs that the Jamisons had walked away from the truck and into the wilderness. The case quickly went cold. Theories proliferated, but evidence was scarce. Had the family been abducted? Murdered? Had they walked into the wilderness and gotten lost? The Sans Bois Mountains are remote, heavily wooded, dangerous terrain. But why would they leave their truck with all their belongings, including their dog and $32,000? For 4 years, the disappearance of the Jamison family remained a complete mystery. November 16, 2013. 4 years after the Jamisons disappeared, 2 hunters were scouting for deer hunting locations in a remote area of the Sans Bois Mountains when they noticed something unusual. Bones, scattered among the leaves and undergrowth. They looked closer and realized with horror that these were human remains. The partial skeletal remains of 3 people, 2 adults and 1 child. The hunters immediately contacted authorities. Search teams arrived and carefully processed the scene. They found shoes, bits of clothing, adult teeth, arm and leg bones, bone fragments. The remains were scattered, partially concealed by years of falling leaves. The location where the remains were found was less than 3 miles from where the Jamison family's truck had been abandoned in October 2009. The remains were sent to the Oklahoma office of the chief medical examiner for analysis. Due to the advanced state of decomposition after 4 years, identification wasn't immediate. Anthropological and forensic pathological testing was required. On July 3, 2014, the medical examiner's office officially confirmed what everyone suspected. The remains were those of Bobby Jamison, Sherilyn Jamison, and Madison Jamison. The Jamison family had been dead since shortly after they disappeared in October 2009. They'd been lying in the woods less than 3 miles from their truck for 4 years while searches came up empty, while theories swirled, while their family waited for answers. But the medical examiner could not determine a cause of death. The bodies were too decomposed. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones. No bullet holes, no fractures, nothing that definitively showed how they died. One of the skulls had a small hole that was initially suspected to be from a gunshot, but later analysis couldn't confirm this. The hole could have been from decomposition or animal activity rather than a bullet. Without a cause of death, without witnesses, without any clear evidence of what had happened to them, the Jamison family case remained as mysterious as ever. When police reopened their investigation after finding the remains, they reviewed evidence from 2009 that had seemed odd, but hadn't led anywhere at the time. The most unsettling piece of evidence was security camera footage from outside the Jamison home, recorded the day they disappeared. The footage showed Bobby and Sherilyn loading their truck, preparing for the trip to look at property. But their behavior was bizarre. They walked back and forth between the house and truck dozens of times, moving items in a slow, trance-like manner. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't interact normally. They moved mechanically, silently, as if in some kind of fugue state. Investigators who watched the footage described it as deeply unsettling. The couple looked like they were sleepwalking, or under the influence of drugs, or experiencing some kind of psychological break. Had they been drugged? Were they suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning that affected their behavior? Were they in some kind of dissociative state? The footage raised more questions than it answered. Also puzzling was what wasn't found. Sherilyn was seen in the security footage placing a brown briefcase into the truck. That briefcase was never located. Neither was a handgun that Sherilyn owned. Both had vanished along with the family. Had the briefcase contained something important? Had someone taken it from the truck after the family disappeared? And what about the gun? Had Sherilyn taken it with her when she left the truck? So where was it? The $32,000 found in the truck also remained unexplained. Sherilyn's mother suggested it might have been payment for the land purchase, though that seemed like an unusual amount to carry in cash to look at property. Others speculated about drug involvement, that the money was either payment for drugs or proceeds from selling them. But if the Jamisons were involved in a drug deal, why would they bring their 6-year-old daughter? And if it was a drug deal gone wrong, why hadn't the money been taken? In the absence of definitive answers, multiple theories emerged about what happened to the Jamison family. The murder theory suggested the family had been killed by someone, either randomly or deliberately. Bobby's father, Bob Dean Jamison, was an obvious suspect given the protective order and Bobby's claims about threats. But Bob Dean had died in December 2009, 2 months after the family disappeared, and had been in poor health at the time. His brother claimed Bob Dean was either in hospital or a rest home when the Jamisons vanished and wasn't capable of being involved. But could Bob Dean have hired someone to kill his son's family? The theory had some plausibility, though no evidence supported it. Another suspect was Kenneth Bellows, a handyman who'd stayed with the Jamisons briefly. After discovering he had white supremacist beliefs, Sherilyn had kicked him out at gunpoint. Bellows was reportedly part of a group called the United Knights, and Sherilyn's name was allegedly on a hit list, but police investigated Bellows and cleared him. An empty pill bottle with his name on it found in the truck was explained as left from a previous occasion. The drug deal gone wrong theory focused on the $32,000 and the couple's strange behavior in the security footage. Perhaps they'd been meeting someone in the mountains to buy or sell drugs. Perhaps something went wrong. Perhaps all three were killed, and the killer left the money behind, spooked by having murdered a family, including a child. But this theory struggled to explain why the Jamisons would bring Madison to a drug deal, and why their bodies were found so close to the truck rather than having been hidden more thoroughly. The cult theory came from Sherilyn's mother, who believed her daughter's family had been murdered by a religious cult operating in southeastern Oklahoma. The theory pointed to the Jamisons' religious paranoia, their talk of witches and ghosts, their strange behavior. But no specific cult was ever identified, and no evidence supported cult involvement. Some theorized that the family had been placed in witness protection because of Bobby's father's alleged involvement in drugs and crime. This would explain their disappearance without violence. But the discovery of their bodies in 2013 definitively ruled out this theory. The exposure theory suggested the family had simply gotten lost in the mountains. Perhaps they'd walked away from the truck to explore the property, gotten disoriented, and died from exposure. Oklahoma in October can have cold nights. If they'd wandered into the wilderness without proper clothing or preparation, hypothermia could have killed them. But this theory struggled to explain why they'd left the truck with all their belongings, including coats that would have kept them warm. The frustrating reality of the Jamison family case is that nearly every question about it remains unanswered. Why did Bobby and Sherilyn exhibit such strange behavior on the security footage? Were they drugged? Suffering from mental illness? Under some kind of psychological distress? Where did the $32,000 come from? What were they planning to do with it? What happened to Sherilyn's briefcase and handgun? Were these items taken by whoever killed the family? Or did Sherilyn have them when she left the truck? Why were the bodies found so close to the truck? If the family had been murdered, why weren't they hidden more thoroughly? If they died from exposure, why had they left the truck at all? How did they die? The medical examiner couldn't determine cause of death. Were they shot? Poisoned? Did they die from exposure? Without soft tissue to examine, without bullets or other evidence, the pathologist couldn't say. Who saw them last? A man who lived in the mountains reported seeing the Jamison family on October 8, 2009, but said he saw no one else in the area. Was he telling the truth? Or did he see something he didn't report? The case has been investigated extensively. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the Latimer County Sheriff's Department, the FBI, all have examined the evidence, followed leads, interviewed witnesses. But no arrests have been made. No suspects have been definitively identified. One investigator noted that the case has an overwhelming amount of evidence, but all of it is circumstantial or contradictory. Every piece of evidence seems to point in multiple directions simultaneously. The remote location where the bodies were found was searched multiple times in 2009 without finding anything. An assistant special agent from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation explained that falling leaves had potentially obscured the bodies during earlier searches. But 3 miles is not a great distance. Why didn't search dogs find them? Why didn't aerial searches spot them? The answer appears to be that the mountainous, heavily wooded terrain, combined with the bodies being scattered and partially buried by leaves, simply hid them too effectively. Today, 15 years after the Jamison family disappeared, their case remains officially unsolved. No one has been charged with their deaths. No definitive explanation for what happened to them has emerged. The Jamisons were a troubled family. Bobby's chronic pain, his conflicts with his father, his religious paranoia, Sherilyn's mental health issues, her talk of witches and poisoned cats, the family's isolation, pulling Madison from school, planning to live in a storage container in the mountains. These factors suggest a family in crisis, people who were struggling, who perhaps weren't thinking clearly, who made decisions that put them in danger. But troubled families don't usually vanish without a trace. And the evidence at the scene, the $32,000 left behind, the security footage showing their strange behavior, all suggest something more than a family simply getting lost in the woods. The most likely explanation, given all the evidence, is that the Jamisons were murdered. By whom and for what reason remains unknown. Perhaps it was related to the cash they were carrying. Perhaps it was connected to Bobby's father or the conflicts within that family. Perhaps it was a random encounter with someone dangerous in the remote mountains. But without witnesses, without a clear cause of death, without anyone coming forward with information, the truth may never be known. For the extended Jamison family, particularly Madison's half-brother and the families of Bobby and Sherilyn, the lack of answers has been agonizing. They buried their loved ones, but they still don't know what happened to them. The case serves as a reminder of how remote the American wilderness can be. The Sans Bois Mountains aren't far from civilization by distance, but they're isolated enough that 3 people could disappear completely, be murdered or die from exposure, and lie undiscovered for 4 years. Bobby Jamison was 44 years old when he died. Sherilyn was 40. Madison was 6. A family of 3 who drove into the mountains one October morning and never came home. Their truck was found with everything inside except them. Their bodies were found 4 years later, just miles from where the truck sat. But how they died, who killed them if someone did, what they were doing in those mountains with $32,000 in cash, all remain mysteries. The Jamison family case is one of frustration. So much evidence, yet none of it conclusive. So many theories, yet none proven. So many questions, yet no definitive answers. Perhaps someday someone will come forward with information. Perhaps a deathbed confession will emerge. Perhaps new forensic techniques will allow the remains to be re-examined and a cause of death determined. But for now, the Jamison family mystery remains exactly that. A mystery. 3 people who vanished into the Oklahoma mountains and were found dead years later. Their fate unknown. Their story incomplete. If you have any information about the Jamison family case, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation continues to accept tips. Even 15 years later, information could matter. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share the Jamison family's story. Remember Bobby, Sherilyn, and especially 6-year-old Madison, who deserved better than she got. Thank you for listening tonight. Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a 4-year-old boy who was snatched from his front yard in 1984 while his mother looked away for just moments. A family terrorized for years by anonymous letters and calls from someone they called the Crow, a father who shot his own cousin in revenge, a mother accused of killing her own child, and a murder that remains unsolved 40 years later, tearing apart a family and haunting an entire nation. This is the story of little Gregory Villemin, France's most infamous unsolved case. Lapangis-sur-Vallon. It's a small village in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, population barely 900. In 1984, it was the kind of place where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were impossible to keep and grudges could fester for lifetimes. Gregory Villemin was born on August 24, 1980. He was the only child of Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin, a young couple in their mid-20s who were building what appeared to be a successful life together. Jean-Marie worked as a foreman at a local car parts factory. It was a good job with decent pay and prospects for advancement. Christine worked in a textile factory. Together, they earned enough to buy a handsome house in Lapangis-sur-Vallon, what locals called a chateau, though it was really just a nice villa. They owned 2 cars. They had leather furniture. By the modest standards of their village and extended family, the young Villemins were doing well, perhaps too well. In September 1981, when Gregory was just 1 year old, the letters began. Anonymous letters written in crude, threatening language. Letters that expressed hatred toward Jean-Marie, that referenced his job as the boss, that promised vengeance for some unnamed offense. Letters accompanied by phone calls, a voice so agitated and distorted that listeners couldn't even tell if it was male or female. The letters contained detailed knowledge of the Villemin family's private lives. Information only someone close to them would know. Schedules, movements, relationships. The anonymous author wasn't a stranger. They were someone within the family's orbit, someone watching them closely. The media would later call this anonymous tormentor Le Corbeau, the Crow. The term came from a 1943 French film about poison pen letters in a small town. It was a part-meant. The Crow's letters and calls were poison, slowly destroying the Villemin family's peace. For 3 years, the harassment continued. Jean-Marie and Christine tried to ignore it, tried to protect their young son from knowing about it. But the letters kept coming. The calls kept coming. "I hate you so much," one letter read. "The day you die, I will spit on your grave." The Villemins reported the harassment to police, but in a small rural community where everyone was related to everyone else, investigating proved difficult. Who could it be? A jealous relative? A coworker angry about Jean-Marie's promotion? Someone with a grudge no one understood? October 16th, 1984, was a Tuesday, a normal autumn day. Christine was home with 4-year-old Gregory. He was playing in the sand pit in their front yard. Christine watched him through the window as she went about her housework. She looked away for just a few moments. Just moments. When she looked back, Gregory was gone. Christine Villemin immediately panicked. She ran outside calling for her son. She searched the yard, the road, anywhere a 4-year-old might have wandered. But Gregory was nowhere to be found. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Christine called the police to report Gregory missing. Around the same time, Jean-Marie's uncle Michel received a phone call. The voice was frantic, loud, barely comprehensible. But the words were clear enough. "I have taken the boy of the boss. I have thrown him into the Vallon." The Crow had made good on years of threats. Little Gregory had been kidnapped. A massive search was launched immediately. Police, firefighters, volunteers combed the village and surrounding countryside. Teams searched along the Vallon River, the waterway that wound through the valley. At approximately 9 p.m., about 4 hours after Gregory disappeared, searchers found him. His body was in the Vallon River near the village of Docelles, about 7 kilometers from his home. He was fully clothed in his blue anorak. His hands and feet were bound with rope. His woolen hat had been pulled down over his face. Little Gregory had drowned. Whether he'd been alive when put in the water or already dead, the medical examiner couldn't definitively determine, but he'd been deliberately bound and placed in the river by someone who meant to kill him. The news devastated not just the Vilman family, but the entire region. A 4-year-old child, murdered. The village of Lapangee-sur-Valognes was thrust into the national spotlight, and that spotlight would never fully leave. The next day, October 17th, another letter arrived at the Vilman home. "I hope you die of grief, boss. Your money will not bring your son back. This is my revenge." The Crow had done exactly what they'd threatened to do for 3 years. They'd taken Jean-Marie's greatest treasure and destroyed it. The investigation moved quickly, focusing on the extended Vilman family. The Crow's letters and calls indicated intimate knowledge of the family. The killer had to be someone close. Bernard Laroche was Jean-Marie's first cousin. They'd grown up together, had been close friends. Laroche lived nearby, had access to the family, knew their routines. On November 5th, 1984, just 3 weeks after Gregory's murder, Bernard Laroche was arrested. The evidence against him came from 2 sources. First, handwriting experts suggested Laroche's writing resembled that in some of the Crow's letters. Second, and more damning, Laroche's 15-year-old sister-in-law, Muriel Ball, told police she'd witnessed Laroche taking Gregory away in his car on the afternoon of October 16th. Laroche denied everything. He insisted he'd been elsewhere that day, that he had nothing to do with Gregory's murder, that he'd never written the letters or made the threatening calls. But the evidence seemed solid. Handwriting analysis, though not an exact science, pointed to him. Muriel Ball had identified him as the kidnapper. Prosecutors felt confident they had their man. Then, just days after implicating her brother-in-law, Muriel Ball recanted. She claimed police had coerced her testimony, had pressured her as a vulnerable teenager to say what they wanted to hear. She said she'd lied. She hadn't seen Bernard Laroche with Gregory. She didn't know anything about the murder. The case against Laroche began to crumble. The handwriting analysis was deemed inconclusive. Without Muriel's testimony, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. On February 4th, 1985, a judge ordered Bernard Laroche released from custody. There was insufficient evidence to hold him or proceed to trial. Jean-Marie Vilman was in the courtroom that day. He watched his cousin walk free, the man he believed had murdered his son. In front of reporters and cameras, Jean-Marie made a public vow. "I will kill him." Police should have taken the threat seriously. They should have offered Laroche protection. They did neither. On March 29, 1985, Bernard Laroche was leaving work at a sawmill when Jean-Marie Vilman appeared. Jean-Marie shot his cousin multiple times, killing him in the factory parking lot in front of witnesses. Jean-Marie was arrested immediately. He was eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to 5 years in prison, serving 4 before his release. Bernard Laroche's widow successfully sued the French state for failing to protect her husband after Jean-Marie's public threats. But the damage was done. Laroche was dead, unable to defend himself, unable to prove his innocence or confess his guilt. And Gregory's murder remained unsolved. With Bernard Laroche dead and the investigation stalled, attention turned to an unthinkable possibility. Had Christine Vilman killed her own son? In March 1985, graphologists examining the Crow's letters identified Christine's handwriting in some of them. Cord identical to that used to bind Gregory's hands and feet was found in the basement of the Vilman home. More circumstantially, Christine had been seen at the post office on the day of Gregory's murder. What was she mailing? Some of the Crow's letters had been postmarked from that office. In July 1985, Christine Vilman was arrested and charged with murdering her son. The accusation was devastating. Not only had Christine lost her child, now she was accused of killing him. The media descended on her with savage intensity. Speculation about her guilt dominated French newspapers and television. The famous writer Marguerite Duras wrote an article for Liberation newspaper suggesting Christine had killed Gregory in a moment of maternal psychosis. Duras had no evidence, no expertise in psychology or criminology. But her celebrity gave weight to her baseless theories. helping to whip up public judgment against Christine. Christine was pregnant with twins at the time of her arrest. The stress of the accusation and the investigation caused her to launch a hunger strike. After 11 days, she collapsed and miscarried, losing one of the twins. The case against Christine was built largely on the graphology analysis and circumstantial evidence. But handwriting analysis is subjective and often unreliable. The cord found in the basement proved nothing. Many households have similar rope. Her presence at the post office on October 16th didn't prove she'd mailed anything incriminating. Most fundamentally, there was no plausible motive. Why would Christine murder her own son? The prosecutors couldn't explain it beyond vague theories about mental instability. In February 1993, after years of legal battles, a court issued a rare order forbidding Christine's prosecution. The evidence was insufficient. She was innocent, but the damage to her reputation was permanent. Many people continued to believe she'd killed Gregory despite the lack of evidence and the court's exoneration. The Gregory Villemin case didn't just destroy the lives of Jean-Marie and Christine. It tore apart an entire extended family and exposed the dark underbelly of a small rural community. The motivation for Gregory's murder, investigators believed, was jealousy. Jean-Marie had succeeded professionally while some of his relatives struggled. He'd built a nice house while they lived more modestly. He'd risen to a supervisory position, becoming the boss that the Crow's letters obsessively referenced. In the close, insular world of Lapangee-sur-Vallon, such success bred resentment. The Villemin and Laroche families, all interconnected through marriages and generations of living side by side, fractured into factions. Some believed Bernard Laroche had killed Gregory. Others insisted he'd been innocent, making Jean-Marie a murderer who'd killed the wrong man. Still others believed Christine was guilty despite her exoneration. Jean-Marie's parents, Albert and Monique Villemin, had also received Crow letters over the years. They became embroiled in the investigation, suspected at various times of involvement or knowledge they weren't sharing. Jean-Marie's half-sister Jeanette Villemin was arrested in 2017 but later released without charge. Gregory's great-aunt and great-uncle, Jacqueline and Marcel Jacob, were arrested the same year based on new handwriting analysis suggesting Jacqueline had written some of the Crow letters. The Jacobs were elderly by then, in their 70s. They denied involvement. Their lawyers argued there was no scientific proof, that handwriting analysis alone wasn't sufficient to convict. They were eventually released as well. The case had a tragic coda. Jean-Michel Lambert, the investigating magistrate who'd initially handled the case in 1984, committed suicide in 2017. He'd been heavily criticized for his investigation, for the wrong turns and mistakes that had allowed the real killer to escape justice. The weight of that failure and the public condemnation that came with it apparently became too much to bear. Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin relocated to the Paris area to escape the village where their son had been murdered and their lives destroyed. They had 3 more sons but never forgot Gregory. They've spent 40 years fighting for justice, cooperating with periodic reinvestigations, hoping that someday, someone will finally be held accountable. The Gregory Villemin case has never been officially closed. It's been reopened multiple times as new forensic techniques became available. In 2000, DNA testing was conducted on stamps used on the Crow letters. The results were inconclusive. In 2008, more sophisticated DNA testing was attempted on the letters, the rope that bound Gregory, and other evidence. Again, inconclusive. In 2013, DNA testing on Gregory's clothing and shoes. Still inconclusive. The problem, investigators explained, was that the available DNA was contact DNA, trace amounts from touching items, rather than blood or other biological material that would provide definitive identification. Contact DNA can be ambiguous, contaminated, difficult to interpret with certainty. In 2017, the case was reopened yet again. This time, modern analysis techniques applied to the letters and recorded phone calls led investigators to believe the Crow was actually 2 people, a man and a woman working together. This led to the arrests of Marcel and Jacqueline Jacob and Jeanette Villemin in June 2017. The theory was that they'd conspired with Bernard Laroche to terrorize Jean-Marie's family out of jealousy over his relative prosperity. But the evidence remained circumstantial. Handwriting analysis suggested Jacqueline might have written some letters. Voice analysis couldn't definitively identify anyone from the distorted phone recordings. Without physical evidence linking them to Gregory's actual murder, prosecutors couldn't proceed. All three were eventually released. The case once again went cold. In 2020, a new examining magistrate took over, bringing fresh perspective. He conducted a series of witness interviews, hoping that after so many years, people who'd been afraid to speak might now come forward. In March 2024, an appeals court ordered fresh DNA and voice analysis at the request of Jean-Marie and Christine, who have never stopped fighting. They believe modern technology, particularly advances in AI-assisted voice recognition and DNA genealogy, might finally identify their son's killer. As of late 2024, this new analysis is ongoing. The Willemins, now in their 60s, continue to hope, but 40 years is a long time. Many potential suspects are now dead. Evidence has degraded. Memories have faded. The Gregory Villemin case has become embedded in French national consciousness in ways similar to how JFK's assassination haunts America or Madeleine McCann's disappearance haunts Britain. It's been the subject of thousands of newspaper articles, dozens of books, multiple television documentaries, including a 2019 Netflix series. It's been analyzed in university research projects, debated endlessly in French media, discussed by every generation of French people who've lived through it. The case represents a perfect storm of tragedy. A child murdered, family destroyed, a justice system that failed spectacularly, accusing innocent people while the real killer escaped, a media that abandoned responsibility, promoting unfounded theories and destroying reputations, a small community torn apart by suspicion and accusation. The case also reveals darker truths about rural French life. The jealousies that fester in close communities, the way success can breed resentment, the long memories for slights real and imagined, the willingness of someone to murder a 4-year-old child as revenge for perceived injustice. Who killed little Gregory? After 40 years, we still don't know with certainty. Bernard Laroche remains the prime suspect for many, including some investigators and the Willemins' lawyers. But Laroche is dead, killed by Jean-Marie before he could be proven guilty or innocent. Was it the Jacobs, as some evidence suggests? Were they part of a conspiracy with Laroche? Or were they uninvolved, merely suspects in an investigation desperate for someone to blame? Was it someone else entirely, someone who's never been seriously investigated, who's lived 40 years knowing they got away with murder? The Crow letters stopped after Laroche's death in 1985, which some take as evidence he was the killer. But a final letter was reportedly received by Gregory's grandmother in summer 1985, suggesting either Laroche wasn't the Crow or he had accomplices who continued after his death. Gregory Villemin was 4 years old when he died. A little boy who loved to play, who had his whole life ahead of him, who was murdered for reasons he couldn't have understood, punished for his father's success in a crime that defies comprehension. His murder remains unsolved 40 years later. His parents have lived their entire adult lives seeking justice that's been denied. His killer or killers has never been definitively identified or held accountable. The case has destroyed multiple lives beyond Gregory's own. Bernard Laroche, shot dead by Jean-Marie. Christine Villemin, accused of killing her son and losing a twin to miscarriage from the stress. Jean-Michel Lambert, the magistrate who committed suicide. The extended family, fractured beyond repair. The village of Lapangee-sur-Valognes, forever associated with this tragedy. French prosecutors continue to work the case. The latest DNA and voice analysis may finally provide answers. Or it may be another dead end in a 40-year chain of disappointments. Gregory Villemin deserves justice. His parents deserve to know who killed their son before they die. France deserves resolution to a case that has haunted the national psyche for 4 decades. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Gregory's story. Remember the little boy whose life was stolen for reasons that make no sense. Thank you for listening tonight. Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the world's most famous mystery writer who became the subject of her own real-life mystery. A woman who vanished one December night in 1926, triggering a nationwide manhunt involving over 1,000 police officers, 15,000 volunteers, and even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. She was found 11 days later in a hotel, checked in under her husband's mistress's name, with no memory of how she got there. This is the story of Agatha Christie's disappearance. Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller was born on September 15, 1890, in Torquay, Devon, England, the youngest of 3 children in a comfortable upper-middle-class family. Her childhood was relatively happy, though she was educated at home rather than attending school, leading to a somewhat isolated but imaginative upbringing. Agatha grew up reading voraciously. She devoured detective stories, particularly those of Sherlock Holmes creator Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. She began writing poetry and short stories as a young woman, though publication seemed a distant dream. During World War I, Agatha worked as a nurse in a Red Cross hospital, where she gained extensive knowledge of poisons and medicines, knowledge that would prove invaluable in her future career. It was during the war that she met Archie Christie, a dashing Royal Flying Corps pilot. They married on Christmas Eve 1914, just as Archie was about to be deployed to France. After the war, the couple settled into married life. In 1919, their only child, Rosalind, was born. That same year, Agatha published her first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, introducing the world to Belgian detective Hercule Poirot. The book was modest success, but it marked the beginning of a remarkable literary career. By 1926, Agatha Christie had published 6 novels. Her 6th, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, had just been released and was receiving critical acclaim for its innovative twist ending. Her career was ascending. She was becoming known as a clever, reliable writer of detective fiction. But Agatha's personal life in 1926 was unraveling. Her beloved mother, Clara, had died in April after a prolonged illness. Agatha had been devastated, spending months sorting through her mother's belongings at the family home in Torquay, a process that deepened her grief. More damaging still was her marriage. Archie Christie had become distant, impatient with his wife's grief. He spent more time away from home, supposedly on business or playing golf. But the truth was worse than Agatha suspected. Archie was having an affair with Nancy Neal, a younger woman they'd met through mutual friends. In August 1926, Archie asked Agatha for a divorce. She refused. The idea of divorce in 1926 carried significant social stigma, particularly for a woman. Agatha wanted to save her marriage, believed they could reconcile. But Archie was insistent. He wanted to be with Nancy. He wanted to end his marriage to Agatha. On Friday, December 3, 1926, the Christies had an argument at their home in Sunningdale, Berkshire. Archie announced he was leaving for the weekend to stay with friends. Agatha pleaded with him not to go. He went anyway. That evening, Agatha Christie kissed her 7-year-old daughter Rosalind goodnight. Then she walked out of her house and disappeared. Saturday morning, December 4th, 1926. A man walking near Newlands Corner in Surrey, a scenic spot on the North Downs, noticed a car parked at an odd angle near a chalk quarry. The car's headlights were still on. The driver's door was open. He approached and looked inside. It was a Morris Cowley, a popular model. Inside the car, he found a fur coat, a small suitcase containing clothes, and an expired driver's license. The license identified the car's owner, Agatha Christie, the mystery novelist. There was no sign of Mrs. Christie herself. The man contacted police. When officers arrived and examined the scene more carefully, the situation appeared ominous. The car was perched precariously near the edge of the quarry. Had there been an accident? Had Mrs. Christie gone over the edge? Or had she driven there deliberately and then walked away, perhaps intending to end her life? Not far from Newlands Corner was a place called the Silent Pool, a deep pond surrounded by local legends. Some whispered that Mrs. Christie might have drowned herself there, perhaps creating in real life the kind of mysterious death she wrote about in fiction. By Saturday evening, word of Agatha Christie's disappearance had reached the press. By Sunday, it was front-page news across Britain and beginning to spread internationally. The police launched a massive search operation. Deputy Chief Constable Kenward of Surrey Constabulary took personal charge. Over the following days, the search would involve over 1,000 police officers, 15,000 volunteer civilians, bloodhounds, and even aircraft. One of the first times airplanes were used in a search for a missing person in Britain. The Silent Pool was dragged repeatedly. The woodland around Newlands Corner was combed systematically. Theories proliferated in the press. Had Agatha Christie been murdered? Her husband Archie immediately came under suspicion. He'd been having an affair. He'd wanted a divorce. He'd argued with his wife and then left for the weekend. The timing seemed suspicious. Had she committed suicide? The combination of her mother's death, her failing marriage, and the pressure of her growing literary fame might have become too much to bear. Or was this an elaborate publicity stunt? Some cynical observers suggested that a mystery writer couldn't buy better publicity than creating a real-life mystery around herself. As days passed without finding Agatha Christie, the case became a national obsession. Newspapers devoted pages to speculation. The public was gripped by the mystery of the missing novelist. Archie Christie gave interviews defending himself against suggestions he'd harmed his wife. He appeared genuinely distressed, claiming he had no idea where Agatha might be. He said she'd been under strain from her mother's death and their marital problems, but he never imagined she'd disappear. Nancy Neal, Archie's mistress, also found herself under scrutiny, though she tried to remain out of the spotlight. Meanwhile, amateur detectives joined the search. People from across Britain traveled to Surrey to help look for the missing writer. Some searched the countryside. Others offered theories to police, each convinced they'd solved the mystery. Fellow authors became involved. Dorothy L. Sayers, herself a detective fiction writer, visited the scene of the abandoned car, studying it as if it were a crime scene from one of her novels. She would later incorporate elements of Christie's disappearance into her own book, Unnatural Death. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, took an unusual approach. He visited a spiritualist medium, bringing one of Agatha's gloves in hopes the psychic could use it to locate the missing woman. Whatever insights the medium provided, they didn't lead to finding Christie. The reward offered by a newspaper grew to £100, equivalent to about £7,500 in modern currency. Home Secretary William Joynson Hicks personally pressured police to find the novelist. But despite all efforts, Agatha Christie remained missing. 5 days, 6 days, a week, no credible sightings, no body, no ransom demand, no communication whatsoever. Detectives began examining Christie's recent manuscripts and letters for clues. Had she left hints in her writing about what she planned to do? But her unpublished work offered no revelations. Then, on December 4th, the day her car was found, something occurred that wouldn't be discovered until much later. Agatha Christie had tea in London and visited Harrods department store, marveling at the Christmas displays. She'd been in London while police searched Surrey. From London, she'd traveled north to Yorkshire, to the spa town of Harrogate. The Harrogate Hydropathic Hotel, known locally as the Hydro, was an upscale spa resort in the Yorkshire town of Harrogate, about 200 miles north of London. Harrogate was famous for its mineral springs and attracted wealthy visitors seeking health treatments and relaxation. On Saturday, December 4th, 1926, the same day her car was found abandoned in Surrey, a woman checked into the Hydro. She signed the register as Mrs. Teresa Neal from Cape Town, South Africa. Teresa Neal, the surname of Archie Christie's mistress. Whether this was conscious choice or subconscious expression of her trauma, no one would ever know for certain. The woman claiming to be Mrs. Neal fit in well at the hotel. She dressed smartly. She took her meals in the dining room. She participated in evening dances. She chatted pleasantly with other guests. She appeared to be exactly what she claimed. A South African woman on holiday, enjoying the amenities of a fashionable spa town. She read newspapers each day in the hotel lounge. Those newspapers contained front-page stories about the search for missing novelist Agatha Christie, complete with photographs. But Mrs. Neal showed no reaction to the stories, no sign of recognition. Other guests noticed her. She was attractive, well-spoken, friendly. Some chatted with her over meals or during entertainment in the hotel's public rooms. For nearly 2 weeks, Mrs. Teresa Neal lived at the Hydro, participating fully in hotel life, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior beyond her apparent lack of recognition of her own identity. Then, on Tuesday, December 14th, 10 days after Agatha Christie's disappearance, a waiter at the hotel had a realization. The woman calling herself Mrs. Neal looked familiar. He'd seen her photograph in the newspaper, the missing novelist. He contacted the hotel management. They contacted the police. Meanwhile, Agatha's brother-in-law had told investigators he believed Agatha might have gone to a spa town, perhaps Harrogate, to recover from her nervous state. Police in Yorkshire had been asked to check hotels, but in the chaos of the massive search, Harrogate hotels hadn't been thoroughly checked until after the waiter's tip. When police arrived at the Hydro and discreetly confirmed the guest's identity, they contacted Archie Christie. On Wednesday, December 15th, Archie traveled to Harrogate with police. The plan was to confront Agatha in the hotel's dining room during dinner, a scene that would be dramatic enough for any Christie novel. Wednesday evening, December 15th, 1926. The dining room of the Harrogate Hydropathic Hotel. Archie Christie entered with police and took a seat in a corner of the room. He waited, watching the doorway. Other diners, unaware of the drama about to unfold, ate and conversed normally. Then Agatha walked in. She was dressed well, composed, carrying herself with the confidence of someone entirely at ease. She took her seat at a table and began reading a newspaper. The newspaper's front page announced her own disappearance. She read it without visible reaction. Archie approached her table. Witnesses later reported that when he greeted her, Agatha looked up at him with puzzlement. She seemed to recognize him as familiar but couldn't place him. "Agatha, it's me, Archie," he said. She stared at him, struggling to remember. The man who'd been her husband for nearly 12 years was a stranger whose face she couldn't quite place. They sat for dinner together, an awkward, tense meal while curious hotel guests and staff watched from the edges of the room. Journalists, alerted to the discovery, began arriving at the hotel. Archie Christie told reporters his wife was suffering from complete memory loss, possibly from a concussion sustained during a car accident. 2 doctors examined Agatha that evening and confirmed she appeared to be in a state of amnesia, unable to recall how she'd arrived in Harrogate or anything about her disappearance. The next day, the Christies traveled by train back to London. At King's Cross Station, hundreds of people gathered to catch a glimpse of the novelist whose disappearance had captivated the nation. The crowd was so large that police had to escort the couple through. From London, Agatha was taken to Abney Hall in Cheshire, the home of her sister Madge and brother-in-law James. She stayed there in seclusion for weeks, shielded from the press, reportedly recovering from what her family described as a nervous breakdown. But the public reaction to her reappearance was mixed. Some expressed relief and sympathy. Others were skeptical. The amnesia story seemed too convenient. Had she orchestrated an elaborate hoax? In the 98 years since Agatha Christie's disappearance, multiple theories have been proposed to explain what happened during those 11 days. The publicity stunt theory suggests Christie deliberately disappeared to generate attention for her books. The timing, shortly after publication of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, seemed suspicious to cynics. And indeed, the publicity worked spectacularly. Newspapers serialized her novels next to stories about her disappearance, and her book sales doubled. But this theory has significant problems. Christie was already successful. She didn't need a publicity stunt. Moreover, the personal cost was enormous. Her reputation suffered, with many people viewing her as manipulative or attention-seeking. The stigma followed her for years. The revenge plot theory suggests Christie disappeared to frame her husband for murder. By abandoning her car near a quarry and vanishing, she ensured Archie would be suspected. The timing of her disappearance forced him to cancel a planned weekend with Nancy Neal, ruining their plans and subjecting both to police scrutiny. This theory requires believing Christie was vindictive and calculating even in her emotional distress. It also assumes she was sound enough mentally to plan and execute an elaborate scheme. The genuine amnesia theory, supported by contemporary doctors who examined her, suggests Christie experienced what's now called a dissociative fugue state. This is a rare psychological condition where someone experiencing extreme trauma or depression essentially steps outside their normal identity and creates a temporary alternate personality. Modern psychologist Dr. Andrew Norman argues Christie was indeed in a fugue state. The trauma of her mother's death combined with her husband's betrayal and request for divorce created unbearable psychological pressure. Her mind, unable to cope, essentially shut down her sense of self. In a fugue state, people can perform complex tasks, traveling, checking into hotels, conversing normally with strangers, but they have no connection to their previous identity or memory of their actions during the fugue. The name she chose, Teresa Neal, wasn't conscious mockery of her husband's mistress, but rather her subconscious mind's attempt to process the betrayal. She became the other woman, perhaps psychologically trying to understand what Archie saw in Nancy. For decades, Agatha Christie refused to discuss her disappearance publicly. She became intensely private, rarely granting interviews, carefully controlling her public image. But in 1928, during her divorce proceedings, she gave one detailed interview to the Daily Mail explaining what had happened. The interview has been largely overlooked by people who prefer to believe she staged the disappearance. In that interview, Agatha stated she'd been in extreme emotional distress the night of December 3, 1926. She'd felt suicidal. She'd driven her car to Newlands Corner with confused intentions. After crashing the car and hitting her head, she'd wandered in a dissociated state, eventually making her way to a train station and traveling to Harrogate. She described having no memory of being Agatha Christie during those 11 days. She genuinely believed she was Teresa Neal from South Africa. When her husband appeared at the hotel, she'd recognized him as familiar but couldn't place him. After psychological treatment, she was able to piece together some of what had happened, but gaps remained. The trauma had been so severe that her mind had essentially shut down to protect itself. Modern biographer Lucy Worsley, in her book Agatha Christie, a very elusive woman, argues persuasively that Christie's disappearance was exactly what she claimed: a serious mental health crisis, not a game or publicity stunt. Worsley points out that Christie paid a heavy price for her disappearance. She was viewed with suspicion by many. Her reputation suffered. She was accused of wasting police time and public resources. The press was often cruel, suggesting she was a tricksy, difficult woman, rather than recognizing she'd been seriously ill. The incident shaped how Christie presented herself for the rest of her career. She became self-deprecating, downplaying her enormous success, avoiding publicity. She never wanted to be the center of attention again. She divorced Archie in 1928. He married Nancy Neal shortly afterward. Agatha found happiness again with her second husband, archaeologist Max Mallowan, whom she married in 1930. That marriage lasted until her death in 1976. But she never forgot those 11 days. In her autobiography, written late in life, she devoted only a few paragraphs to the incident, calling it a time when she'd been ill and had suffered from a complete loss of memory. Agatha Christie went on to become the best-selling novelist of all time, with only the Bible and Shakespeare's works exceeding her sales. She wrote 66 detective novels and 14 short story collections. She created enduring characters like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple. Her play, The Mousetrap, has run continuously in London's West End since 1952. But the mystery of her 11-day disappearance in December 1926 continues to fascinate. It's a story that seems to belong in one of her own novels. A woman vanishes from her car at night, is searched for by thousands, and is found days later with no memory, checked into a hotel under an assumed name. The truth, however uncomfortable, is probably the least sensational explanation. Agatha Christie had a severe mental health crisis. She was grieving her mother, facing divorce, under pressure from her growing fame, and her mind simply broke under the strain. In 1926, mental illness carried enormous stigma. Admitting to psychiatric problems could destroy a reputation. The press and public couldn't accept that the clever mystery writer had simply been human, vulnerable, suffering. So they invented more dramatic explanations. Publicity stunts, revenge plots, elaborate games. These narratives were more comfortable than acknowledging that even the most successful, creative people can experience devastating